10 really weird US state borders and why they exist. So I watched a video recently where apparently there's a town that literally is halfway through the US and Canada. Like one town. So that there's a place, I think it was a library, that there's a big long black line that runs through it where you're literally on US territory, then Canadian territory if you jump over the line. And it just made me think, why is that the case? Because, you know, even if that town was established before the borders were drawn, why not just draw like the border like over the town so that it's like a clean, you know, like, do you see what I mean? Like, why does that town exist?
The US is an unusual country, mostly because it's made up of 50 smaller, semi-autonomous states that have their own borders. And while the country was expanding and creating new states in the 1700s, 1800s, and 1900s, those borders got weird.
Man, like some of the states are just gargantuan compared to the others. Like, look at the size of this one and this Texas compared to like these. Like, which ones is this? Rhode Island? Like, is that like, yeah, some of these on the East Coast are so small compared to the ones here in the mid, I think this is the Midwest, right?
Here are the 10 weirdest state borders and why they exist. We're going to start in the east with one of the most unusual peninsulas and make our way to the weirdest state border.
The Delmarva Peninsula.
The Delmarva Peninsula is one of the strangest state border anomalies in the United States. Despite being a single geographic landmass, it is divided among 3 different states: Delaware, Maryland, and Virginia, with borders that don't always make much sense at first glance. At its core, the peninsula is physically isolated from the mainland by the Chesapeake Bay to the west and the Delaware Bay to the north. Yet the way its borders are drawn is the result of centuries of colonial disputes and political compromises dating back to the 1600s.
Wow.
The boundaries of Virginia and Maryland were initially set by royal charters granted before the United States existed. But the south end of the Delmarva Peninsula was excluded from Maryland in their charter because Virginians had already settled there. Meanwhile, Delaware basically functioned as an extension of Pennsylvania for a long time. The boundaries of Maryland and Delaware and Pennsylvania were the subject of a long-running dispute between the Penn family, who were in charge of Pennsylvania, and the Calvert family, in charge of Maryland. Maryland initially claimed all of modern Delaware, but its charter excluded lands already settled by Europeans. And the Penns held that the existence of the original Dutch colony in Delaware meant that it was not part of Maryland.
Gosh, I mean, disputes over land have got to be one of the oldest, like, sources of human conflict ever. You know, I have this land, it's mine. No, we were here first. No, we were here first. No, we were here. Like, it's been going on. I mean, we're seeing an example of it play out now. You know, you guys know what I'm talking about. And yeah, that one's been going on for thousands of years.
As a result of a court proceeding, the peninsula was ultimately divided more or less in half between them. Now, if you think the Delmarva Peninsula is weird, just wait until you see Maryland.
Yeah, because the way that one was drawn, like all of the jagged edges and stuff like that, really, really odd.
Maryland has one of the strangest shapes of any US state, largely because of its long, narrow panhandle that stretches westward between Pennsylvania, West Virginia, and Virginia. In some places, this strip of land is less than 2 miles wide, making it one of the thinnest parts of any US state. The origins of this odd shape go back to colonial land disputes between Maryland, Pennsylvania, and Virginia, which then included West Virginia. The Mason-Dixon line, surveyed in the 1760s, officially set Maryland's northern border with Pennsylvania, but its western boundary was less straightforward. The problem started with conflicting colonial charters. The original charter for Maryland granted it all the land west along the Potomac River, but at the time, nobody knew where the river ended, and Pennsylvania was determined to have their southern border at the 40th parallel.
How did they even, you know, because when they were drawing these maps, and like dividing up the land, they didn't have satellites or any kind of photo imagery stuff. So how would they like decide where is Pennsylvania? You know, how did they even calculate that?
As such, Maryland's panhandle got very squished in some parts. The panhandle became even more pronounced when West Virginia broke away from Virginia in 1863 during the Civil War. The northern border of West Virginia followed the meandering Potomac River. which further exaggerated Maryland's strange, squeezed shape. Despite its odd borders, Maryland's Panhandle is home to important historical and cultural sites, including Harper's Ferry, just across the river in West Virginia, and Antietam Battlefield, the site of one of the Civil War's bloodiest battles. Speaking of oddball panhandles, West Virginia's got an interesting one.
Do you reckon there'll ever be a time where some of the states join up, you know, maybe try and like move away from the United States and like form their own country? Do you guys ever see that happening? I mean, right now it probably seems unthinkable, but I mean, 20 years, 30 years down the line, could like a clump of southern states try and break off and be their own sort of country, do you think? Could California go its own way?
West Virginia's northern panhandle is a narrow strip of land that stretches northward between Ohio and Pennsylvania, creating one of the most unusual state borders in the country. At its narrowest point, it is only 5 miles wide, yet it extends nearly 70 miles up towards Pittsburgh, separating Pennsylvania from Ohio along the Ohio River. This strange shape is the result of colonial land disputes and the geography of the Ohio River. Before West Virginia became a state, this region was part of Virginia, which had laid claim to all the land south of the Ohio River. When West Virginia broke away from Virginia in 1863, the new state inherited this odd stretch of land. One reason the Panhandle exists is because of Wheeling, a key settlement along the Ohio River. In the early 1800s, Wheeling became an important transportation hub, and when West Virginia split from Virginia during the Civil War, it was actually West Virginia's first state capital. The Panhandle's shape ensured that Wheeling and its surrounding region remained part of the new state rather than being absorbed into Pennsylvania or Ohio. While this Panhandle seems like it should geographically belong to Ohio,
yeah, I mean, it makes the most sense, just like looking at it from this angle. Like, if you're standing there, it's less obvious, but it would just be a lot more clean if it was part of Ohio, don't you think?
Michigan's Upper Peninsula definitely seems like it should belong to Wisconsin.
Interesting.
Michigan's Upper Peninsula definitely stands as one of the most illogical state borders within the United States, mostly because it's geographically closer and connected to Wisconsin. The reason for this odd division dates back to the early 1800s and the dispute over Toledo, Ohio. In what became known as the Toledo War, both Ohio and the Michigan Territory claimed the same strip of land around Toledo. The federal government intervened and sided with Ohio, granting it the land. But as a
Interesting. I wonder why they agreed, like with Ohio. Why not just split it down the middle and, you know, give each 50-50?
consolation, Michigan was given the Upper Peninsula when it became a state in 1837, a trade that initially frustrated Michigan residents because many saw the Upper Peninsula as the worthless, remote wilderness. Luckily for Michigan, however, vast iron and copper deposits were discovered in the mid-1800s, kicking off a mining boom that made the Upper Peninsula an economic powerhouse for the state, drawing in thousands of workers and fueling Michigan's industrial growth. Despite its economic importance, the Upper Peninsula remains culturally distinct from the rest of Michigan. Its people, known as Yoopers, have a strong regional identity, shaped by their isolation and close connections to Wisconsin and Canada. The Upper Peninsula is separated by water from the rest of Michigan, which makes it pretty weird. But what if a single river separated multiple states from their land? Well guys, this is it. This is the very last bit of Huel I have left. Huel has been with me since the day I left the United States. Focus on what really matters.
The Mississippi River border. Is the Mississippi River the longest river in the world, or is it one of them? I think it might be the longest in the world.
The Mississippi
Or is that the River Nile, actually, in Egypt?
River is one of the most important natural boundaries in the United States, dividing multiple states as it flows from Minnesota to the Gulf of Mexico. However, the river's course has shifted dramatically over time, creating strange border anomalies where pieces of some states appear on the wrong side of the river. The most famous example is the Kentucky Bend, a small exclave of Kentucky that sits on the western side of the Mississippi River, completely surrounded by Missouri and Tennessee. This oddity was created by the river's natural meandering and the fact that state borders were drawn based on where the river was located at the time, even though the river kept moving. Another example is Kaskaskia, Illinois, which was once the first capital of Illinois, but is now on the west side of the Mississippi River.
I had no idea that rivers moved, by the way. I just thought that you know, but I suppose, yeah, as the water flows, erosion happens, right? Which maybe widens it and just, yeah. Because, yeah, I would have never thought that rivers bent or moved. I thought they were just where they were is where they were, and that's where they would always be.
Seemingly inside Missouri. This happened due to a major flood in 1881 when the river shifted its course and left Kaskaskia stranded on what is now the Missouri side.
Wow, it moved that much. Okay, so this isn't just erosion, it literally just moved.
Despite this, the land remains legally part of Illinois, though only a handful of people still live there today. These changes happened because the Mississippi River is not a fixed boundary. It naturally erodes and shifts over time, cutting new channels and leaving old meanders behind. This is why today's borders don't always match the river's current course. The Mississippi River makes some weird borders, but Missouri managed to create one of the most bizarre boot heel shaped borders in the entire country.
Is it the Mississippi River that powers the Hoover Dam? Like, I think it is, or which body of water is it that the Hoover Dam is sort of like built between, if you know what I mean?
The Missouri boot heel is a small but distinct part of the state that juts southward into Arkansas when it logically should just continue straight. This oddly shaped region exists because of a mix of political maneuvering, historic disputes, and economic interests in the early 1800s. When Missouri was preparing for statehood in 1820, the original plan was for its southern border to be a straight line at latitude 36 degrees 30 north. This would have placed the boot heel within Arkansas territory. However, a wealthy landowner named John Hardman Walker lobbied aggressively to keep the region in Missouri. Walker and other local landowners argued that the area had closer economic and social ties to Missouri rather than Arkansas. They convinced Congress to adjust the border southward.
God, this map here is not easy to look at. I mean, maybe if it was like really big in front of me, but
incorporating the boot heel into Missouri rather than leaving it to become part of Arkansas. This change created an unnatural looking border that extends about 30 miles further south than the rest of the state, forming the boot heel's distinctive shape. Today, the area remains culturally unique, sharing similarities with both the South and the Midwest. Moving south, the Mississippi River continues to define most state borders, except for a large part of Louisiana.
Wow. Whose job is it to determine where borders are? Is it a surveyor? Like how does somebody even back in the 1600s become a surveyor? I'd love to know. Do they literally just have to walk across the land finding rivers and other natural sort of borders and say, okay, this is where, this border ends sort of thing?
Louisiana Shoe, also known as the Mississippi Thumb, is an odd protrusion of Louisiana that extends northward into Mississippi, creating an unusual and seemingly misplaced section of the state. This strange shape is a result of historic land claims, surveying errors, and political decisions that left Louisiana with a border that doesn't align with the rest of the state. The unusual boundary dates back to the early 1800s, when the United States acquired the Louisiana Territory from France in 1803. At the time, the exact borders of the newly acquired land were vague. When Louisiana became a state in 1812, its eastern border was set at the Mississippi River, but there was confusion about whether certain lands on the east bank of the river belonged to Louisiana or Mississippi. The result was the Shoe, a section of land that juts eastward into Mississippi. The reason for this is likely tied to early land grants and settlements, where Louisiana landowners and residents had already established claims before the border was finalized. Rather than force these settlers to switch states, the land remained part of Louisiana, even though it appears out of place on modern maps. By buying the Louisiana Territory from France, the United States acquired a vast region, and that means they had to carve it up.
Man, that must have been the best deal, probably one of the best deals in history, because they probably bought it for, relative to what it would be worth today, not even pennies on the dollar. Not even pennies.
Creating some really strange and geometrically accurate borders.
Mate, I'm sure if France could go back, they would definitely not have sold it. 1000%.
Colorado and Wyoming are two of the few states in the US that appear to be perfectly rectangular on a map. However, their nearly straight-line borders are not as simple as they seem. When the United States expanded westward in the 1800s, Congress used the Public Land Survey system to divide land into neat grids based on latitude and longitude. Colorado and Wyoming were both designed as surveyed states, meaning their borders were intended to follow strict geometric lines rather than natural landmarks like rivers or mountains. Colorado's borders were drawn when it became a territory in 1861, designed to be a nearly perfect rectangle extending between latitude 37 degrees north and 41 degrees north, and longitude to 102 degrees west and 109 degrees west. Wyoming was created later, in 1868, and was given the same rectangular shape, extending north of Colorado between 41 degrees north and 45 degrees north. However, despite their intended perfection, neither state is truly a perfect rectangle. Early surveyors—
I mean, it's probably not possible for it to be a perfect rectangle, because like Colorado, with all the mountains and stuff there, it's just probably not even possible to have it perfectly, like the border to be a perfect straight line. Or is it?
Faced difficulties in accurately marking longitude and latitude, meaning that minor distortions exist in the borders. If measured precisely, small errors and irregularities can be found, especially in rugged or remote areas. The result is that while Colorado and Wyoming may look like simple, uniform squares on a map, they're secretly a little curvy. Speaking of curvy states, did you know that Idaho and Montana are the only states that have a border defined by the Continental Divide?
Yeah, I heard that Montana has more cows than people. Is that true? Like, even that's nuts. Like, even if Montana is like a fairly sparsely populated state relative to the size of Montana, because I think Montana, in terms of like square miles, is massive. To have more cow, could you imagine if the cows got smart and they were like, let's overthrow our human overlords, and they banded together? Mate, the people of Montana, they'd be in trouble.
Idaho's Panhandle is a narrow strip of land that extends northward between Washington and Montana. But unlike most panhandles, which extend east or west—
yeah, Montana is massive.
Idaho's Panhandle stretches vertically and fully separates two other states. In the mid-1800s, the area that would become Idaho was originally part of the larger Washington Territory. However, when Idaho became a separate territory in 1863, its boundaries were drawn in a way that left it with an unusually long and narrow northern section. The reason for this was largely political compromise. The western boundary was set at Washington's existing border, while the eastern boundary followed the Continental Divide, separating it from Montana. The result was a 300-mile-long strip of land that is only about 50 miles wide at its narrowest point. Some residents at the time even felt the Panhandle would have been better off as part of Washington or Montana, but the decision was made to keep it with Idaho. Despite being part of Idaho, the Panhandle has strong economic and cultural ties to Washington. Cities like Coeur d'Alene and Sandpoint are much closer to Spokane, Washington than to Boise, which is over 400 miles away. This has led to a historic divide between northern and southern Idaho, with the Panhandle sometimes feeling like its own distinct region. And finally, moving south, we have the only triangular state in the country.
I wonder, with those states where like there's sort of like a divide there, if there's ever like a rivalry between the two different cultures, like, you know, whether each one thinks that their culture's better or their culture is the true, like in Idaho's example, like we're the real Idaho people, you know, no, we are. Because it always tends to happen, like even in London, like even within North London, you know, there's like two sides of North London. There's the sort of like posh parts of it, and then there's the sort of like less posh parts, and you know, each side is like, oh, you know, they kind of look down their nose at the other side.
Nevada is one of the most oddly shaped states in the US, with a distinct triangular extension at its southeastern corner. This strange border, which juts downward towards Arizona, is the result of territorial disputes, political bargaining, and economic interests in the 1800s. Originally, Nevada was much smaller when it became a territory in 1861. It was shaped more like a vertical rectangle, bordered by California to the west and Utah to the east. However, as the Civil War progressed, The federal government, which controlled the territories, made multiple changes to Nevada's borders to strengthen its political and economic influence in the West. In 1866, Congress approved an expansion of Nevada's territories to include what is now the southern tip, taking land away from the Arizona Territory. This area, which includes present-day Las Vegas, was given to Nevada for a few key reasons. First up is political loyalty. Nevada had become a state in 1864 and was strongly aligned with the Union during the Civil War.
Man, how much do you reckon they paid? Like the people that built the first casinos in Vegas, what do you reckon they paid for that land? If they even paid, maybe they were given it, you know? And now, like the Vegas Strip, it's got to be one of the most expensive places to buy land, maybe in America, maybe in the world.
Whereas Arizona Territory had Confederate sympathies. Expanding Nevada helped secure Union control in the region. Second was access to the Colorado River. The added land gave Nevada a small section of the Colorado River, which was important for future water rights and economic development for the state. And finally was the economic potential. At the time, this land was mostly desert, but it was seen as valuable for future transportation and mining. The completion of the railroad and later the construction of the Hoover Dam would prove that this extension was an important economic.
Wow, so flat. I know I say this a lot, but America really has a lot of spaces where it's very flat. I mean, here in the horizon, you've got mountains and stuff, but like this massive patch here is very, very flat.
Asset. Today, this southeastern extension is home to Las Vegas, the largest city in Nevada and the heart of its tourism and gaming industries. Without this border change, Las Vegas might have been part of Arizona, fundamentally altering the economic landscape of both states. It might seem like state borders don't really matter, but they do. In fact, Georgia and Tennessee are in a border dispute to this day. And just like with countries, state borders decide who gets what natural resources. So fundamentally, these are very interesting things to look at. Speaking of interesting things, be sure to check out my latest travel geography.
Great video. I mean, it must be so complicated deciding who gets what, you know, because going back, it's impossible to know like who got somewhere first. Like, you know, just because the government says, oh, this belongs to this person. If somebody has a claim that, let's say, oh, my family moved here, you know, in 1066, before the government was even around, I should get the rights to this land. You know, these disputes, as we can see in the Middle East, can really rage and rage and rage and become very, very like, you know, serious situations. So yeah, the people who decide where these borders are get my respect, because it is not an easy job. Thanks for watching, guys, and I'll see you in the next one.